Hello and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 21 and today I want to talk about the last great encyclical on usury called Vix Pervenit. It's been a while since I've posted a video and so it's mostly been because I've been working on a couple of essays or articles to publish in some academic journals, and one of them really dives deep into Vix Pervenit. And so here I kind of want to talk about some of the interesting things that I learned, and in addition to just what the encyclical teaches. So let's just kind of dive in. So the first thing to kind of get out of the way is a little bit of the historical background of Vix Pervenit. So the big thing that actually happened was, so the encyclical was actually promulgated in 1745. However, there was an issue that came up in 1740 in the city of Verona, which I believe is in Italy, where I think it was the city issued a 4% bond. And so there was a great sort of outcry about whether this bond was actually usurious. And part of the reason for that was because at the same time, and in fact I believe it was on the same day, a new edition of St. Antonius of Florence's Summa Theologiae was published. And I think this was quite intentional. I forget who actually did it. I think it might have been Peter Bellerini. So that kind of kicked off the controversy in 1740. And so a number of different authors were trying to address the controversy. And one of the big things that came up was that, or this theory that arose, was the idea that one could take interest from a loan or otherwise debt from a merchant. And so you see this distinction between a loan of consumption, which was mutuum consumptionis, versus a loan of production, mutuum productionis. And so this idea kind of was starting to gain more ground and being more ardently argued for. And so it originates with as far as I can tell, it goes back to a Parisian priest in around the late 17th century. So roughly 40 to 60 years before the Verona Bond, who had proposed. And so this Parisian priest proposed this distinction between a loan of consumption and a loan of production. And if you are familiar with Hilaire Belloc's work, then you might have heard of this kind of distinction, where with the loan of consumption, you taking interest or profit on that loan is usury, whereas if you have a loan for productive purposes, a loan of production or a productive loan, then you can take some sort of profit on that. And that was the distinction this Parisian priest had made. And it had spread and developed, especially in France. And it was further kind of spread by a Dutch Jansenist in 1742, I think. And so this spread even more with time as this controversy continued to rage. And so, in 1745 and, probably before that, I don't have any information on when it started, but Benedict XIV had called together some of the greatest minds of canonists and theologians to address this question of what is usury. And there are some specific notes that Benedict makes in his encyclical regarding why he's doing this. So this is kind of the controversy, and one of the important things with relation to Benedict is that his friend Scipio Maffei, I think it's Italian names, I don't know how to pronounce it, but his friend Scipio was defending this particular theory and had published a book on it. And so some people were thinking it should be added to the index and so forth and so on. Now, some of the things to know about Benedict specifically, though, is first of all, he was very well read. He had been Archbishop of, was it Bologna? I can't remember. But he was Archbishop for a while, and he had a very large library, so he was very well read. He had worked in the causes of the saints for many years, and had written one of the most systematic works on how to review a case as far as miracles and so forth for the causes of the saints. And so when he became Pope, he actually opposed a lot of the use of the index to add or to forbid books. And part of this was because, one, it was being used as a political tool. Two, was books were not actually being reviewed very well, and so forth. And so part of that might explain why Scipio's book was never put on the index. The other thing to remember is he was very gregarious, he was very diplomatic, and so that kind of flows into what will happen after the encyclical is promulgated, because after the encyclical is promulgated in 1745, part of the issues that then arise is one, he never actually condemns any contract, so he says he'll leave that up to the canonists and so forth. And so he doesn't actually address the controversy explicitly, but the document lays out sort of the sort of traditional doctrine of the Catholic Church and on usury. However, with respect to his friend Scipio, he allowed him to publish a second edition of his work, which had to include a copy of Vix Pervenit as an appendix. So, however, the encyclical itself appears to condemn the theory that Scipio is actually defending. And so the fact that he was allowed to publish the book, it was not put on the index, Scipio was not punished in any way. In fact, all of that makes it look like Benedict is kind of approving of this theory or tolerating it, however you want to put it. So later controversies arose around how to even understand Vix Pervenit because of Benedict's actions after the encyclical. And so in the 19th century, roughly 90 years later, there was a great deal of controversy around, well, how are we supposed to understand Vix Pervenit? Some people took it that this theory of the loan of production and loan of consumption, it was practically approved by Benedict because of his actions. And so many questions were sent to various Roman congregations, so the Sacred Penitentiary, the Holy Office, and so forth. And so a lot of these questions were like, well, there's great controversy that arises around, these contracts. Some authors are more rigid than others, and so how are we supposed to understand this? because you would have authors, or you would have priests who were saying, okay, well, a merchant would come into confession, and the priest would know that he was, contracting these, loans for profit to businessmen, and he would not absolve them because they would refuse to stop. Whereas other priests were much more lax, where they wouldn't even require them to mention them, even if they knew. And so there's controversy in how to practice absolution and reconciliation there. The issue that the bishop brings up is, well, can we pick like a middle way? Let's say until the Holy See definitively makes a statement on this, that the lender will make a promise that he will submit to the Holy See once they make a judgment. But he can still receive absolution in the meantime, because the question's still up in the air. Now, as far as I can tell, the question has been definitively resolved by Vix Pervenit, because as we'll see, it's pretty clear that it's explicitly rejected. But there's this confusion. And so I think it was Pius VIII said, let them not be disturbed. And so this was what would become the classical formulation. And here he's talking about let the penitents not be disturbed. And so question regarding specifically the practice of penance, and how to go about absolving penitents who are at least suspected of usury. So that's kind of the historical background and some of the consequences of it, because this would then go on to lead to questions in Vatican I, where various bishops and archbishops and such would submit questions like, well, we need to resolve this. The church needs to make a definitive statement because of these responses coming from the Roman congregations. And how are we supposed to understand this? Because it seems at times that they're saying, well, yes, you can take profit on this, or at least don't disturb the penitents, and so forth. So there's a great deal of controversy, and it was seen as to be not a settled issue. So that's kind of the historical background and consequences, which is really interesting to someone like me who's trying to trace the lines, because what you kind of get then is you get authors who, because Vatican I never actually addressed the question because it was disrupted by I think it was the invasion of the Prussians, and so you have this whole issue of the question is never resolved. And then you kind of get into the 20th century where you start having a lot of authors who are proposing, well, an intrinsic title to usury. Well, you can just take it, like Father Cleary in his book on usury claims an intrinsic title to usury. That you can take more from a loan merely from the act of lending. And then Father Michael Cronin in his book, The Science of Ethics, he also makes an argument for an intrinsic title to usury. Father Thomas Devine in his book, Interest, a historical and analytical analysis, something like that, also makes an explicit claim that, well, there's an intrinsic title to usury, and so forth as you go on. And so it's almost taken for granted. And so there's just a lot of confusion around what does usury mean, when is it forbidden, and so forth. So being able to connect those dots is interesting for me, as someone who's trying to figure it out, to kind of work your way back to the true doctrine. So first thing kind of wanted to discuss is the infallibility of Vix Pervenit, because it was actually very controversial whether this document was infallible. And it was very controversial for a long time, even before some of the early 19th century authors, like the Dutch Jesuit Viersmich. I'll never pronounce his name correctly, but he wrote the Catholic Encyclopedia article on usury, which people read and cite all the time. And I think he just directly contradicts Vix Pervenit. I'll leave it at that for now. And so even looking at some of these older works, you find people arguing whether Vix Pervenit is infallible, going back to the 1830s, when these questions are starting to arise. And so there's a few reasons why I think Vix Pervenit is probably infallible. So there's three conditions for infallibility. One is that the Pope is speaking as the supreme shepherd of the church, so the subject. And then second is the object, that he is speaking on a matter of faith and morals. And then third is that he is speaking, the actual act itself is an act that's a definitive sentence, or it's a definitive statement about faith and morals, or faith or morals. So the first thing, is he acting as the supreme shepherd? And so this is a good question. Usually it's revealed that the Pope is acting as supreme shepherd when he sends out this document to the whole church. So he's acting as the teacher of the whole church. Now, Vix Pervenit is sent out only to the Italian bishops. And so that is actually Viersmich's argument that it is not infallible, because he only sends it to the Italian bishops. Now, that is not in itself a impediment to it being an infallible statement, because by the very act of teaching a doctrine or some faith or doctrine of faith or morals in one area implies that it applies to the whole church. So that's possible. And John Joy, in his book, Disputed Questions on Papal Infallibility, provides an example of that, where the Pope sent a document to one area, and because of the very nature of the decision, it would apply to the whole church. So that's not in itself necessarily an impediment to the infallibility. So a few signs that he is speaking as the supreme shepherd. First of all, he talks about he's taking up his apostolic office. And so he's talking about, well, he's taking up his office as the supreme pontiff. This is also confirmed that this is his intention by his document, by his work De Synodo, which was something he started as an archbishop on how to conduct a regional synod or a diocesan synod. And so in that, there's where he discusses usury. He talks about how having been lifted up to the seat of Peter, he was responding and meant to clarify this question of the Catholic faith, to keep it free from all error, and to clarify this question. And so there, it seems quite clear that when he says he's taking up his apostolic office, that he means that he is taking up his apostolic office as supreme shepherd of the church. So there is ambiguity there, but it seems clear that this is his intent. Some of the other things, so the object, very clear. Usury is, it's condemned by Scripture as evil. It's it's a matter of scriptural dogma. So it's not. It is a. This is probably something where I could use someone's help to maybe distinguish these two, because it seems that it is an object of it's a primary object of infallibility, because it's a matter of faith itself, because it's condemned in Scripture. So it's not part of the secondary object, which is like those things that are necessary for or implied by dogmas of the faith. So there are certain things that are necessary so that there is such a thing as human nature that Christ could take on, because how could Christ be fully man and fully God if there was not such a thing as human nature, for example? That's probably a bad example, but nothing comes off the tip of my tongue right now. But there's this distinction between the primary and secondary object of infallibility. And I think usury is part of the primary object, because usury is taught as evil in Scripture. That it is specifically in a mutuum, I think, is perhaps part of the secondary object. But I don't know the distinctions well enough to work that out. But also things like that the census contract is licit. That seems to definitely be part of the secondary object, because the question with respect to the reason the church can speak infallibly about the census contract is because it is necessary to, in order to follow the doctrine of usury, it is necessary that we know this sort of contract is not usurious. Because otherwise there would be question about, as there was, that the census contract is usurious. And so it becomes confusing and difficult to follow the doctrine, to religiously and piously follow the church with respect to usury. If the church does not cannot infallibly say that the census contract is not usurious. And she has said that it's not usurious. So I think that would be a case of the secondary object, at least as I understand it. I'm not a dogmatic theologian, though I play one on TV. Not really. I'm not on TV. Anyway, so I think Benedict is acting as the shepherd of the whole church. I think he makes that clear. I think he is speaking on a matter of faith and morals. And now the third question is, well, is this supposed to be a definitive act? And so some of that seems to be from the Ste Synodo as well, because he's trying to clarify the doctrine. Now there's a few things in Vix Pervenit that also suggest this. So he says he's calling these theologians together to come up with some sort of opinion regarding some sort of teaching regarding usury. And so Father Ernest Van Roy, who would later become Cardinal Van Roy, suggests that because this is really just presenting the opinion of the congregation that came up with it, because it's not something that Benedict himself wrote. And you can see that in the text, that this is the opinion of the congregation. He suggests that because of that, among a couple of other, I think, rather trivial other things, that this is not an act of a definitive doctrine, though Van Roy argues that this Vix Pervenit applied to the whole church from its very promulgation, and he has some other documents that he cites supporting that. The reason I would dispute that is because it seems like that Benedict is trying to set out a certain doctrine, is the way that he puts it at the beginning. And so it seems like he wants to say, I want a definitive doctrine regarding usury. And so the doctrine is presented, and then he goes on to say that he confirms and approves this. Now, that isn't necessarily, I solemnly declare and define this to be the doctrine of usury. However, he does say that he approves and confirms it. And given that, along with the certain doctrine and along with what he says in the De Synodo, that all taken together suggests that this is supposed to be a definitive act of setting out this position. And so it seems that this document is infallible, at least in the opinions that he sets forth, that he confirms and approves. Because he goes on later and says some other things. So it's not obvious that those later things necessarily are presented as a definitive statement, but certainly the opinions in what is essentially section 3. So that's the reason I kind of think this is an infallible statement. Someone who understands infallibility better than me probably could dispute that, but I am what I am and I have what I have. So kind of moving on to getting into what's in the document itself. So the first kind of paragraph just lays out pretty much clearly what the doctrine of usury is. So it starts off very clearly that the species of sin which is called usury and which has its proper basis and place in the contract of lending, which is mutuum, consists in this, that someone from the loan itself, so intrinsic, which of its very nature demands that only as much be returned as was received, wishes more to be returned to him than was received, and therefore contends that some profit beyond the principal by reason of lending is due him. Therefore all profit of this sort that surpasses the principal is unlawful and is usurious. So that kind of just lays out the traditional doctrine of usury. So proper basis and origin is the mutuum. That is clear. Anything taken over the principal is usury. And the basis for this has nothing to do with what is granted. It has nothing to do with any of the material components about it. This is based completely on the nature of the contract. That as much was given is to be returned. So, now I'm trying to see real quick, looking through the Latin, if there's anything that needs to kind of be pointed out. Because one of the big things that I've been finding recently is that the kind of correct way of understanding usury is in terms of restitution. And so in here they don't use restitution, they use a different word, which I think is reditare, I think. It's redi, which just means to return. But restitution is kind of a different concept. It's returning what you have received. So it involves, we typically talk about restitution with respect to, a thief who steals something, and so he has to return what he stole. But there's also a sense in which restitution refers to just when I give you something voluntarily, you need to return it to me. So like a book loan is probably one of the easy ones, is when I borrow from the library and I return it back to them, that is an act of restitution. because it doesn't belong to me, though they have given it to me for a time to use. And so there's a distinction in restitution between accepting the thing, between the thing accepted and the way it was accepted. So the thief makes restitution by way of the way it was accepted, the mode of its acceptance. Whereas, the lender, the library lender, returns it kind of respect to the thing that was accepted. And so there's this distinction, and the second one with the library loan is kind of connected with unjust enrichment. So if I take it and I keep it, I'm unjustly enriched because it doesn't belong to me. And so restitution kind of restores that equality. But it's an equality that's based in the very nature of the contract, rather than sort of like this injustice that you're trying to rectify. It's more that you have something that belongs to someone else, and at a certain point you need to restore it to them. So it doesn't necessarily imply an injustice, but it does imply an inequality that needs to be rectified. So, so anything beyond the principle. Now, in the second paragraph is where you get this clear rejection of Scipio's theory and before that, because there's a list of things here where different things are rejected as excusing usury. So it doesn't matter if the profit is not excessive but moderate. No, any profit is usurious. It doesn't matter if the loan is made to a wealthy man instead of a poor man. No. The party also does not matter. It is intrinsically evil from the nature of the contract. So, and then third is that it doesn't matter whether the borrower is going to leave it idle, maybe go buy some food and eat the food, or use it for productive purposes as an estate. And so the way it's put is that he from whom that profit is asked because of the loan itself is not a poor man but a rich, who is not going to leave the sum given to him as a loan idle, but is going to spend it advantageously to increase his fortune, either by buying new estates or by transacting profitable business. And so there's this sense in which even if he goes on to try to make a profit, still that doesn't justify taking usury. And so that seems clearly to reject Scipio's theory, and then back to this Parisian priest. So there we have sort of a summary. So it doesn't matter the quantity of the usury, it doesn't matter who receives it, it doesn't matter what they're going to do with it. So those are kind of all maybe extrinsic matters, like how much, who, what they do with it. So those are all kind of circumstances. Maybe the quantity is not as much of a circumstance because that's kind of intrinsic to the loan. But that's kind of where it lays it out, is not this, not this, not this. And so those are the type of things we see even today. So people are saying, well, usury is really just excessive interest, or it's oppressing the poor, or it's for consumption lending, or in consumption lending. And so all of those things are rejected here in Vix Pervenit. Now, continuing on, they go to If by reason of his obligation and justice, if he should receive it, he will be obligated to restitution by reason of his obligation and justice, which they call commutative justice, and whose purpose is it is both to preserve inviolably in human contracts the equality proper. Yeah. So then it just goes on to say, well, if you do take usury, you have to provide restitution for that. So in the third paragraph, we have sort of, clarifying what was just said. So, or I guess the third sections. There's not quite third paragraph, but here they say, well, it's not to be denied that there may be titles, other titles running parallel to this contract. And so this goes back to the theory of extrinsic contracts. Now, Benedict himself, as a private theologian, did kind of endorse some of the traditional extrinsic contract or extrinsic titles. Excuse me. So in his De Synodo, he defends at least damnum emergens, so financial loss or emerging loss from the loan. And then also lucrum cessans, which is profit ceasing, which is related to profit that you potentially lose for one reason or another from the loan. Aquinas will say, depending on how you interpret those terms, there are ways in which Aquinas will argue for those as well, but it's much more restricted than later scholastics would defend. But the important thing here is to recognize that he says it is not denied. And I point this out just because some people will try to say, well, he's positively approving of extrinsic titles and even look at these particular extrinsic titles. That's not what's going on here. The way it's worded is that he does not deny that they exist. And indeed, it's meant that the prior paragraph, that you cannot take usury from the lending itself, does not imply that there could be other titles apart from the loan where you could take some more. So it's not denying it, but it's also not positively asserting it either. But it also goes on to say, well, it's also not denying that there could be other contracts where you could make some profit. So that are entirely different from the nature of lending, and that's a central point. And so legitimate commerce and business that would procure an honest profit. So the word he uses here is negationem. Oh, I'm so bad at this. Negationem, which is really trading, but it could be just business generally. So this is also so it's kind of hedging in things, clarifying that while all usury is profit, not all profit is usury, as I think it was St. Bernardine would say. And so then, so we don't deny there's extrinsic titles. It's not denied that there's other sources of honest profit. And then it kind of goes on to say, well, even if you enter into these other contracts, or you still need to keep in mind that you still need to be fair and just. So just because it's not usury doesn't mean like it's a free for all as far as how much you can take. As someone once told me, anyway, I'll not talk about that. So yeah, and so if you take more than it is due, even if it's not usury, there's still this necessary for restitution because you've taken more than you're due. But there's still legitimately, sources of profit. Then it goes on, to then advise that, hey, just because there are potentially profits out there, or potentially titles or contracts, doesn't mean that there always is so. But this must be diligently borne in mind, that one would falsely and certainly rashly persuade himself that there is always found and is everywhere present either some legitimate titles together with a loan, or even excluding a loan, other just contracts, by aid of which titles or contracts it is permitted, as often as money grain, or some other kind is lent to another, just so often to receive a moderate increase beyond the whole and sound principle. Now I'm kind of curious, what is the word used there for lend? And it looks like it's creditur, so it's specifically not using mutuum there. And so the issue here is, there's other titles, other contracts, but that doesn't mean that that there's always these titles, contracts, so you don't need to worry about this. So one of the things that Van Rooij discusses in his book is that there is he argues for a universal title to lucrum caesans, and this arises out of discussions by Juan de Lugo, who is called the Prince of the Thomists and second only to Thomas, and Leonardus Lessius, both of whom argued for universal titles. And so this seems to clearly reject that. Now Van Rooij will kind of get around this by saying, well, maybe universal titles in 18th century Italy just didn't make sense, but maybe today it does. Now, that's entirely unconvincing, like almost every other way to get around the usury prohibition. Well, economic conditions have changed, so usury is no longer relevant, and so forth and so on. Because it's explicitly laid out right here, like, hey, doesn't work. Then goes on, what else do we got here? Sometimes just a pure loan without profit is sometimes needed. And sometimes that's the only true and just contract. That sometimes you should just freely give, following our Lord's command. Do not turn away from him who would borrow from you, and lend hoping nothing in return. And so it kind of ends with, to encourage people to examine their conscience and inquire whether there is a just title at all in this contract, so that their conscience may be rendered immune and free of all guilt. So this is kind of the main body of the teaching, I would say, whereas later on he'll continue to admonish people to be diligent about this. Do not just assume that there are always ways to profit on loans. And so he'll even go on further, that saying, you can understand the difference between these different contracts by understanding how the nature of them differs. And this is so essential, because people will not consider how different contracts differ, and many scholars will not either. And it really requires you to dig down and think about what's going on in the transaction. And so one of the conference papers that I'm doing this year is going to be kind of working that out. Like, why is a loan not an exchange, like a commercial exchange, by its very nature? And working that out and sussing that out is actually a very important distinction. One of the PhDs that I had talked to had mentioned this was a very essential issue, and it hadn't occurred to me just quite how essential it is, because so many authors will kind of assume, will either claim explicitly or implicitly assume that, for example, that loans are governed by just price, rather than what we just heard here, where it's really governed by, restitution, that exactly what is taken is returned. So I think probably after the conference, I'll do a video on presenting those conference papers, because I have two. One is going to be on that topic, distinguishing loans from other sorts of contracts, and then what's the other one on? The other one is I think it's titled Aquinas and Usury Synthesizing Roman Law and Aristotle. And that one is really seeing how Aquinas takes the insights of Roman law and the insights of Aristotle to kind of make a more cohesive understanding of usury than either of them present on their own. Which I think is kind of a valuable insight as well, because a lot of people don't understand the way that they fit together, and also the way in which Aquinas utilizes Roman law throughout, because even his thinking on a thing consumed in use originates in Roman law. Now, I'm not going to try to draw the line of like, here's where Roman law says this, and this is how, this is explicitly how Aquinas gets it, or something like that. That's not my intention. My intention is that there are insights from Roman law that he uses, however he inherits those, because consumed in use is explicitly in Roman law and explicitly related to the mutuum and usury. So it seems very probable to me that he inherits it, whether it's through canon law or through some other source. It seems clear that he is utilizing those concepts, because he is utilizing, the mutuum. He does explicitly cite Justinian's Institutes, and then a couple other points. And so it's, how is he inheriting those? Is he reading the digest? I don't know. Or is he just getting that through canon law? So, but yeah, that's kind of the discussion about Vix Pervenit, and it's one of the most important documents. And going back to Verschmich, the Dutch Jesuit, he does explicitly, I think, contradict this teaching, because he argues that under modern conditions, the sort of equality of justice in exchange is determined by just price. And so I'd have to reread what he said. It's not coming to mind immediately, but it seems quite clear that he argues more can be received than was given. And so it would be an explicit contradiction to this teaching. So I would argue, so he would be materially, if not formally, in error with respect to this document. So, but yeah, that's all I got for today. Thanks for listening, and have a good day. We'll talk later.